Southwest Fire Academy was established in 2015 as a response to the recognized need for quality, safe, and affordable fire and rescue training in Ontario. This is not your average fire college. SFA has high standards for their students, and it is their mission to teach and produce qualified, ambitious firefighters who are prepared to work hard to serve their communities. This is not a diploma mill. This is where you can learn strategic, aggressive firefighting from passionate, intelligent instructors who never forget why they were made to do this job. SFA is an accredited private career college that is regulated by the Ministry of Training, colleges, and universities, with a memorandum of understanding with the Office of the Fire Marshal. This means that SFA is an approved training provider with the OFM, and the programs are recognized in Ontario. Check out their pre-service and expanding selection of course offerings at southwestfireacademy.ca. Hello everyone. Welcome to episode 90 of Multiple Calls. I'm Scott Hewlett. It's common for interview panels to ask, why do you want to be a first responder? The common answer is, I want to help people, which tells us nothing about the person and everything about the failure of the question. Why do you want to help people, and how do you want to help people? Dig deeper and open up the conversation. If someone doesn't know why they want to help others, and how they want to help is limited to fighting fires and cutting cars, then they aren't self-aware enough to realize that they are more focused on what they want than what those they serve need. Limiting your identity limits your opportunities. You have more chances to save and change lives with a bag valve mask, a suction unit, comforting compassionate words and presence, and situational awareness than you ever will with AutoX tools or a hose line. And those moments are no less impactful or dramatic. You don't have to solve domestic violence, child abuse, or human trafficking, just as you can't prevent every fire or accident. But you do have the choice to learn to recognize them and take decisive action for those people in those pivotal moments. We don't want bad things to happen to people, but we want the opportunity to be there when they do. Don't throw away opportunities because you think they are boring, below you, or they aren't in your job description. Saving lives is the coolest and most privileged part of this work, no matter the emergency. Stop focusing on what you aren't and double down on what you are. You can move someone when they're unconscious. You can be someone's lungs and heart when they are VSA. You can be a compassionate and caring human when someone's loved ones aren't there. And you can be someone's voice when they are too scared to speak. Here's my chat with Suh Hughart. Start things off by telling me about where you grew up and a bit about your family.
I was a military kid, so I kind of grew up everywhere. I was adopted. I was born in South Korea, and then I was adopted when I was baby. I think we initially lived in Corpus. My dad worked for the Corpus Christi Fire Department as a paramedic for like 10 years. I was an Air Force brat specifically. We kind of lived in different places. Most of the time that I remember, I was living in San Antonio on Medina Base because she was an officer. So we lived in officer housing. She got out of the military when I was sometime middle school age, and we stayed in San Antonio. I think her being in the Air Force was why I wanted to be a fighter pilot. That's the first thing I ever remember wanting. Well, I mean, Top Gun was really big too, because I was born in the 80s. That was what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a fighter pilot until I had to get glasses, and that dream went to an end.
And your mom was an officer, but what did she do specifically?
In the military, she was a clinical nurse specialist that specialized in cardiology. She's worked in cardiology almost my whole life. Sometime, I think when I was like 13, she became a nurse practitioner. She's been a nurse practitioner for, I don't know, like well over 30 years.
And your dad switched from EMS?
So my dad was a firefighter paramedic for about 10 years, I think in Virginia and Corpus, and I think he worked for St. Louis Fire Department for a week, but he hated it. And then he went to nursing school either in the like 89 or 90 because there was no money. Well, the money was better in nursing than fire and EMS, and he had a family. So if you ask him to this day, he'll tell you that he only became a nurse for the money.
How was school for you early on?
I was picked on a lot in elementary school. I think I went to a different school every year, or I changed schools every year. But I mean, we lived in the same place. I just went to a different school. So I was always like the new kid, and I was the only Asian person, and I was small, and I had a name that's really hard to pronounce. And so everybody, like, they go through your names, and I always knew when it got to me because either they said Suh or they were stuck. And after high school, I went to college because it was what you do. It was 2002. So either you went to college or you joined the military or you did both. And then I was in and out of college for a while. I didn't really know what I wanted to be. I mean, if you name a profession, any kind of common profession, I probably wanted to do that at some point. I grew up in the medical field, so I didn't want to be in the medical field. I just wanted to try something new, and nothing really fit. I was working in the service industry for like 8 years. I worked at this place called the Magic Time Machine, and it's a cool concept. Like, people dress up in characters. And then I worked at P.F. Chang's for 4 years. While I was working at the Magic Time Machine, I had this really bad car accident, and that was in, I think, 2006. That left me with a head injury, and I was in the hospital for quite some time. I guess not super long. I was in the hospital, I think, for a little more than a month. And then I was in rehab for a few months after that, trying to get normal again because I couldn't like walk. I mean, I think I was only probably confined to a wheelchair for like 2 weeks. That was weird. It's the only time in my life that I remember having to like teach my brain to make my legs walk. It's something that you do. You just don't even think of it. I was working at a different restaurant, I think P.F. Chang's, and I was burnt out. I was burnt out of the service industry. When I came back from my accident, I was like, I had to go through a lot of things to try and figure out life. You almost die, and then you're like, well, why am I alive? And I had this friend, actually, and she actually kind of changed my life when I had gone back to work because I was complaining about something or life. And she looked at me and she said, like, you can't be a victim to your traffic accident for the rest of your life. And something like clicked. So I was burnt out of the service industry, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was in and out of college. Somehow I came across this EMT class, and I was like, I don't know. Like, I just got to figure out a different way to make money. And I was like, whatever. Like, it's not super expensive, and it's only 3 months. So if I hate it, then whatever, I only wasted 3 months out of my life. And if I like it, at least I can get out of the restaurant industry. And then I fell in love with it. I totally nerded out in class. It's the first time I can really remember in my life that I was just really excited to learn. And I was excited to study. I mean, I guess it didn't feel like studying because the information was just so cool. And it's a lot of information really fast. And so I switched careers, and I guess I haven't really looked back since.
And what were your clinicals like?
My clinicals were great. I think my clinicals went better than I anticipated they were going to go because, I don't know, I grew up in firehouses, and I don't necessarily remember it at the time because I think I was too young. I just remember it through pictures. Medics on ambulances weren't known, from what I could recollect, weren't known for like being nice to students or really welcoming students. So when I went into all of my clinicals, I just went in there thinking like, they're going to hate me. Like, I need to get what I can out of this. Like, this is still networking, and I'm here to learn, but I need to be positive about it. Just expect the worst. Expect that they're going to all be rude. I don't think there was one person on any of my clinicals that was rude. They were all really nice and really welcoming. And one of my write-outs was at San Marcos, Hays County EMS, where I work now. And they were called commanders at the time. Now they're battalion chiefs. There was one on that ride, and I think I asked him about 1,000,000 questions. How long has he done this? How does he like this job? Like, just interesting things. And after I got to know him, it was interesting that he like sat down and answered all those questions. But he was just very receptive, and the medics were really receptive. So I feel like I was really, really lucky there. I did a lot of clinicals for my EMT. I think back in 2010, you were only required to do like 60 hours and have 10 patient transports. But I was a huge white cloud. So it took me 120 hours to get my 10 patient transports. I appreciate it now because it was such a great learning experience. So then I started working in 2011. For a short period of time, I worked for a private transfer company and then a hospital-based transfer company. And then I've been working in a 911 EMS since midway through 2011. And I've been at the same service, San Marcos Hayes County EMS. That's where I've been. I don't really ever remember them like recruiting me or trying to recruit me. They just told me when they were going to have a hiring process. And that's where I showed up. And you take a written test. And then if you were an intermediate or a paramedic, I think there was skills testing. And then there was a physical agility course. And then you interviewed with the director and the director of operations. Back then, you had to start part-time in order to get a full-time spot because they hired full-timers off their part-time list. I was part-time for a while. And then when I started working there, I had just started feeling like I was getting my feet underneath me as an EMT, like in the transfer world. And so then when I started working there, like I didn't know what I was doing all over again. And so there's a lot of learning. And then when I went full-time in January of 2012, there was a lot of learning that I expected it. Everyone I had worked with when I was part-time was really nice. I had gotten a feel for what the culture was like. There was some women that worked there, but I mean, it was still a very male-dominated field. We're not as much of a male-dominated service anymore. My first partner was he wasn't my FTO because I had to wait for an FTO to become available. But he had been there for a long time. He had been a medic for a long time. He was kind of he wasn't old. He's kind of like a salty medic. But that was fine. Like, I'm okay with rough personalities. He was a great partner. You know, like him and my commander at the time, I just expected that they hated me. I wasn't really sure what they ever thought of me. So I kind of just sat there and studied my protocol book all the time. And I was in school as well. So either I was studying my protocol book or I was studying for paramedic school. I mean, they both still work there. They're great people. I just expected that they hated me. I'm not actually sure that people thought I was going to make it.
Were there any other mentors outside of them, though, that were supporting you?
One of my first regular partners was this guy, Swisher. And he had been a medic for a long time. He had that face. He has the best poker face. So he used to make me really nervous because I couldn't tell if he was happy or mad or frustrated. When I first started working with him, I learned to figure it out over time. And his voice inflection was only very slightly different depending on his mood. He was really, really pivotal to me when I was really green and kind of throughout my career. He knew that I wanted to learn as much as I could. And so he used to just throw me in there and he made me do all of the first assessments on patients and kind of helped guide me through that. He taught me to be really, really thorough in my patient assessment and to have a good generic one, at least that you can do on everyone, even when you're dead tired at 4:00 in the morning. He's actually probably the person who helped perfect my assessment because I had to do it when I was terrified. He was really big for me. And then when I finally did get my medic, I had some really great partners through that process. You go through your FTO process. I was a little less of a white cloud in my FTO process than I was when I was a student, but you always had the fallback, right? Like, you always knew, like, well, crap, if I don't know what to do, like, I have an FTO. So there's that. But when I first got on the streets, though, I had some different medic partners. I had like 3 or 4 different medic partners that I ran some really critical calls with that I was grateful, really grateful at the time to have had them. All 3 of them, too, they had come with a lot of experience. So at least I knew, like, if I was going to fuck something up, like, they were there to fix it or not let it happen. But I think the most growth that I got was when I got an EMT partner as a medic. That was the first time that you didn't have a fallback. Like, people just looked to you. And I I'd never really felt that stress before, right? Like there was a battalion chief that was there and he was great. I remember knowing through my medic, people want to like Monday morning quarterback people's calls. And the one thing that he was not okay with was EMTs trying to armchair quarterback a medic's call or saying like, no, they didn't make the right decision, because his thing was always, you've never been in their position. You've always had a fallback. And so if you had never been there, you have no right to complain. I understood it, but I never actually, like, I guess really understood it until I was there and thought, oh my gosh, I've never been this scared in my life. And my EMT partner was brand new. He had just changed careers and just cleared. And so I couldn't bounce anything much off of him.
You were his fallback.
I was his fallback, and I was the fire department's fallback. And I thought, well, how do you call an adult now? But there was a lot of growth. That's probably when I really grew to appreciate the solid patient assessment that I had been taught when I was in EMT. Because even through being scared and being terrified, like I could do a really good assessment. I feel like that's kind of the foundation for most things EMS. We changed medical directors. I changed partners. I was blessed to have the same EMT partner for 8 years at one point, and that was wonderful. She was my best friend. We're still friends. She's one of my best friends, but I feel like there's something that happens in a partnership, and I get it. Your partnership either makes or breaks your day, but even if your partner's salty, even if your partner's whatever, there's no one else that really knows that experience like your partner. Like there's that, I think I've read it before, the Confessions in an Ambulance or something, about how they're the only other person in the world that can understand what you're going through. I think that's just really true.
David gave me a few questions to ask you, and one of them was about your personal protocol book. You mentioned your book before studying it.
Yeah. So let me backtrack. So when I had my brain injury, I had a really bad memory when I first got out of it. And so I had to teach myself how to remember things. Did you ever see that movie, 50 First Dates?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was me. Like I could meet you, do a 360 and just meet you all over again. I learned when I got back to life, like I had to write things down or I would just never remember them. And so when I first started, we had these small little protocol books that we could carry and purchase separately. And I used to write all over it. I'd write notes all over it. I'd write little cheats all over it. And I had little, what do you call them, like divider tabs, so I could just flip to them real quick. Well, we had done away with those because everything went digital. And I wanted to have something that I could still do that with. So when I got my medic, I copied all of our protocols. I think I actually got lucky because Kinko's like maxed me out at $20 and just kept giving me copies, and put together my own protocol book and kind of organized it in the order that made sense for my brain. If you're on a CPR and you want to discontinue, there's a checklist, or there was a checklist for that. And to me, in my brain, it made sense. Well, like have the checklist with the CPR cardiac arrest protocol. So I would do that, and I still carry it. And I've got like my quick drip rates figured out because nobody wants to do the drip rate formula on scene. He told you that. Yeah. And I do. I still carry it 10 years later. It's great. Like I'm really old school, so I like having something like right in front of you, not technology. And I get it. It doesn't help you when you're inside someone's house, but also you should know your protocols. I like having that tactile thing to flip through, and I've got all my cheats written down on it because I write everything down still.
When did you get into teaching?
I think in like 2017, maybe. No, 2018. So our company had an EMT class that we were putting on. I think the intention at the time was to put on paramedic school. They needed instructors, and I was told I could teach it either way, but that if I got my instructor certification, I'd get paid more money. So I got my instructor certification, and I started teaching in there until that kind of went under. We don't put on an EMT class anymore. I still hold my instructor, so I've taught at different places. I'm still on faculty at this place, the Center for Emergency Health Sciences. They do cadaver labs. And when it comes to teaching, that place, not only did that place really kind of help me feel comfortable in an ambulance, but that place made me so much better of a teacher and an educator, because they put on these critical care skills classes. They walk you through the anatomy, the human anatomy, and skills with that. And so you'll perform skills on cadavers. But as an instructor, you teach those skills and you work one-on-one with people for those skills. Just as a medic in general, like you'll do high risk skills that you don't normally do in the field, that you can do, but they're not as common. I remember when the first parts of my medic, there was stuff that terrified me. I would do it if I had to, but I remember kind of thinking like, man, like, I hope people never figure out that I'm not confident in this. And learning those skills like the back of my hand really kind of helped boost your confidence, because you knew, like, regardless of what call you were on, it made my intubation better. It made needle decompression better. It took this massive amount of stress off of high acuity, low volume skills. And so when I didn't have to think about that very much anymore, that's a huge amount of stress that it takes off of you. But it also helped teach me how to teach people how to do the skills and work with them one-on-one to do those skills. And so I'm really grateful for that. I love students. I do. There's bad students, but for the most part, students want to learn, and I love that.
Do you have students ride out with you in the field outside of the clinical lab setting?
Yeah. I always feel bad for whatever partner I'm with, because I tell them that I always tell our clinical department, like, you can put students on my truck all day. Like, that's fine. I love students. And I mean, if they're bad students, they leave at 7:00 anyways. So then you don't have to deal with them again.
And what about the mental impact of the job, and how have you managed through that or watched other people manage it?
I have a really good support system. My family, like my mom, my dad, my husband, like, they're just a wonderful support system. So like, it's nice to have them to talk to, but for a long time, like, you just compartmentalize so many things. And there was a period of time, like, I thought that I was working through things. I like to do things that challenge me. So I was a skydiver for a while, and I thought that was wonderful, and it was exhilarating, and it was great, and it was a great outlet. But I think that what I didn't realize at the time was that it wasn't allowing me to process the information. It was just it was helping me kind of just push everything down and live in the moment, and then on to the next thing. And I mean, it's no fault of skydiving. That's part of what's great about it, is that you're always very in the moment. I went through my mental health struggles. I still go through them now. I just got better coping mechanisms now. I have a therapist, and we talk. I have different things that I've learned to do when I have problems. They don't tell you, and I don't think I've always tried to figure out some sort of positive way to tell people, but I still have yet to figure that out, that the career is going to change your life. You're not going to come out of this career the same person that you went into it. Whether you come out jaded or just scarred or hurt or anything, you're not going to be the same person. And that's a hard thing that wasn't talked about. It's kind of talked about a little more. I was really big into martial arts when I was a kid. And then after I got out of my paramedic, I had gotten into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Martial arts and Jiu-Jitsu really kind of helped me work through some of those struggles. At my lowest, I remember being on the highway for some dumb car accident. Everybody was fine, but it was the middle of the night, and fire and police were directing traffic, and they just weren't paying attention. Like, traffic didn't care that we were there, and someone got like really, really close to me that when they drove by. I just remember thinking, like, I don't even care. I should care, but like, I'm about to get plowed over by all this traffic, and I could just care less. And I don't think I really knew how numb I was to a lot of things until that. And then I remember that night, I mean, granted, I had a lot of personal things I was trying to get through as well. But that night, because we didn't really have a lot of resources back then. And so I remember being in my room, and I'm like down all these reports, but I'm just like, my brain can't function. And my partner was asleep, and so I didn't want to bother her. And I just remember thinking, like, I don't really know who the hell I'm supposed to call right now. Like, it's like 2:30, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, and my brain won't function because even the next call that I could give a shit if I died on whatever the call is. Like, I don't really give a shit. And it's not allowing me to give a shit about my partner either. I think I Googled stuff, and the only thing I could come up with in the middle of the night was the suicide hotline, which was really difficult to get them to understand that I don't want to commit suicide. I just need to talk to somebody. And I think the next day, what I didn't know at the time is my partner, Robin, realized that I was going through all of this. She wasn't asleep. Unbeknownst to me, she was on her phone text messaging our boss, or one of our bosses. And it was that guy, Swisher, that was my mentor. And the next morning, because I think I was being held over or something, the next morning he showed up at our station, and then I walked out with a smile to say hi. And he put his arm around me and he walked me out of the station, kind of to just try to have privacy. And I thought, oh no, he knows something's up. And he was like, how are you doing? And I just broke down. And we're just breaking down into tears. He actually sent me home that day. And I remember looking at him and telling him, I said, like, well, who's going to work on the ambulance? Like, I have to, because, I mean, if you don't have relief, like, they can't just, you got to have relief in order to go home. And he looked at me and he was like, he goes, I'm still a paramedic. And I was like, oh, you're going to work on and I remember being so grateful for that. Like, I think I was off for a few days, and during that time, like, I tried to find someone to talk to, and Tanya Glenn was like all the way up in Round Rock or in the up north area, and she wasn't available. I was down in San Antonio, and that's a really far drive because nothing was virtual back then. So I just remember trying to find like a psychiatrist or a therapist in San Antonio, and I went to a session with one. I went to a few sessions with one, and then I realized, like, man, like, I can't get people to understand our job. Like, this is really frustrating because they think you're crazy for some of the stuff that you say, or they just can't seem to comprehend the job. And you can see it on their faces. I mean, things like Tanya Glenn, I think that's great. Like, having resources that are specifically tailored for just first responders in general is awesome. But I think that having a good support system is so pivotal. That's what helped me pull myself out of that. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was just really massively burned out and overwhelmed with things outside of work, because I was just trying to just push down everything that I was feeling from work. So you just fill your time, because you can't sit in the silence. If you sit in the silence, you recall every bad part of your shift or recall the screams of a mother. It's hard. I try to tell people, like, really, like, if there's a problem, like, and I tell students too, like, if you see anything, if anything affects you, like, if you just relate, it doesn't even have to be a bad call. I think the first call that ever made me cry, it wasn't even a bad call. I think it made me cry because some guy called us for help, and then the cops wound up threatening him because he let his kid stay home from school that day. And it just broke my heart, because I remember thinking, that guy just called us for help and we just made his life a living hell. Just little things.
Yeah, so I just wanted to lead into, how did you come across the topic of human trafficking and wanted to do the deep dive in that world?
Texas puts on an EMS conference every year, and I had been going to them for a few years. And then there was one year I went, and there was a block of time where either the lectures were ones that I'd been to before, or they just didn't sound pertinent to me. And there was this human trafficking lecture, and I remember thinking, like, why are we talking about human trafficking at an EMS conference? Like, sure, why not? Like, let's see what it's talking about. And I went to the class, and there was really, like, less than a handful of people in this real big room. It's sad looking back at it. The woman was talking about these victims that we've encountered, and we just didn't realize that we had encountered them. And the statistics blew my mind. 87.8% of all human trafficking victims had contact with healthcare providers while they were being trafficked. And then 68.3% of them had contact with emergency services while they're being trafficked. That included hospital and pre-hospital, like emergency rooms and us. And I just remember thinking like, oh my God, like those are massive numbers. Like, why is nobody talking about this? And I think this guy, George, I work with, I had told him, I said, did you know that this was so pertinent to EMS? And he said, yeah, it's really bad, because he was really big and close with the police department. I was like, why? Why does nobody talk about this? Why isn't this taught in school? Why isn't, like, we get taught about these horrible things, but nobody is talking about this? So I went on like a year-long deep dive of research. At the end of a lot of lectures, a lot of people put up like different resources that you can contact. And I remember taking a picture of it, and I contacted every single resource that she had put up there. And I sent emails, like I even emailed like the International Labor Organization just to see, but blew me away was that everybody responded. I sent out about 1 million emails thinking that maybe I'd get like a couple back, but everybody was so responsive and helpful. So I had interviews both in person and on the phone and virtually with different people from different organizations. I compiled a lecture and I organized it in the way that I would want the information if somebody was teaching it to me. It gets dark. Like, human trafficking gets really dark. When I did all that, I think I ended up actually having to put it aside for at least a month. Like, I didn't want to think about it, or I could see it. It was taking me to a really dark place, and I didn't want to be there to try to fight out of that again. So I set it aside, and then I submitted it. My medical director, she was wonderful. She helped me with it. I submitted it to our state conference, and then it got accepted. And I thought, oh my God, well, now what do I do? Like, now I'm about to teach at this conference. I met with our medical director, and she was wonderful, except that she deleted like half my slides. And I was like, oh no. People don't realize it because I'm a teacher and I've lectured on some pretty big platforms, but I'm terrified of public speaking. It terrifies me. I had a lot of slides that were in my lecture that were just so that I would remember what to say. And she had told me, Sue, people are either going to listen to you or they're going to read the information on the slides, but they can't do both. And if you make them do both, they're not going to get any of the information. She said, you know the information. You just spent a year doing really heavy research into this. And so you just need to tell the information and just put some simple slide that says, this is the category. And so that's what I did. So when I went back to the conference to teach this time, I thought maybe there was only going to be a few people in the room, because there was only like less than a handful last time. And the room was packed. I think almost all the seats were filled. And I remember my hand was shaking. I was so nervous. But I got through it, and it became something I was I'm still really, really passionate about, because I think that the information is stuff that everybody needs to know, because everybody, everybody, the entire population is vulnerable to becoming a victim. And the way victims are manipulated into it is such a subtle thing, and it's like a subtle thing, but in this little thing. And then all of a sudden they're there, and they're everywhere. What's hard is you get to a point that you see human trafficking in everything around you. And I'm not saying that it's not. I'm not saying that it is. But it changes the way you think of the world.
What are some more obvious, I guess obvious is the wrong word, because like you said, until you start looking for things, you don't see them. But what are some things you can prompt people listening to start to pay more attention to?
A lot of it has to do with the demeanor of people. When it comes to the sex trafficking industry, the average age for someone to enter the sex industry in America is between 14 and 17 years old. And that's a time that not only is that incredibly young, but it's a time that you're going through so much change, right? You're hormonally, you're going through so much change. And so the signs in populations like that, it can be as subtle as their grades were great and now they're not. And this is what the story that you're getting. And maybe the parents or the teachers think it's drugs and still not good, but like also consider that they're being trafficked. Some of the signs are going to seem more like victims of domestic violence and abuse. They're not going to want to make eye contact with you. They're going to seem kind of sullen and depressed. Typically, not always, but typically they're not going to have these obvious injuries, because you walk around with injuries on your body, then people want to know what happened. And so they're very mentally manipulated and traumatized and tortured. And sometimes it's going to appear like a psych patient. Sometimes it looks like drug addiction. In the sex trafficking world, they like to keep their victims high on drugs because drugs allow you to be manipulated. In the labor trafficking world, I haven't actually come across a labor trafficking victim. I've come across suspicions of. My impression is that most labor trafficking victims, not all, most labor trafficking victims in America are not from this country. I only really speak English. I can understand a little bit of other languages, but translators are really dangerous. Translators that are on scene with the patient are a really dangerous thing because you don't know what's being said. Anytime there's a translator, if they speak Spanish, I work with people that are bilingual, so that's wonderful. When it's not Spanish, when it's like Vietnamese, or I think I had a lady once that spoke Arabic, I'm really heavily reliant on Google Translate because I don't care what the other people are saying. Maybe the other person is just answering, and if they do speak English, like maybe they look to the other person for answers. One of the big things in the sex trafficking world is if there's a group of people and they give you a name, everybody else in the group is calling them by a different name. That's actually a huge clue. One of the victims I spoke with, she said that nobody ever knew each other's real names, but she was in contact with healthcare providers a lot. And so she would give her legal name to healthcare providers, but they all called each other by their pseudonyms. That's a big red flag. Things like a lack of awareness of location, like that's pretty massive. Like in the sex trafficking world, that's pretty massive because we just take it as they're altered. Person, place, time, and event. You don't know where you're at. You're altered for some reason. But for them, they're getting moved around. Sex trafficking, like typically they will move their victims around from city to city daily, sometimes multiple times a day. So it's really common that they're not going to know where they're at or what city they're in or have any kind of idea of that. And that's where highways are huge because highways allow them to just move their victims. It's the subtleties. It's when a story just doesn't make sense. What's going on doesn't seem appropriate for the situation. Anytime you have a large group of people living in a small space or a small area, I live in Central Texas, so people tend to think migrants and illegals, but sometimes like victims from other countries, they're not here illegally. They don't even know it sometimes. Like they don't have their identification. Somebody else is holding on to their identification. It's even true in sex trafficking of domestic citizens. Somebody else holds on to all of their IDs. It's sad how easily it can happen in front of your face and just, you don't know.
Maybe there's some differences, but I'm sure it's quite similar between, say, Canada and the United States. But what actions can people take when they have some suspicion outside of letting the police know?
There's a National Human Trafficking Hotline. I think it's 1-888-373-7888, I think is the number. You can call and you can put in tips. You can call and ask them questions, but they investigate 100% of all of their calls. So if you suspect it, you can make the phone call. The phone line is 24/7, 365. There's a text line, I think might only operate Monday through Friday, but that one is Be Free, which is 233-733. And you can text that. You can have them, like, if you think your patient might be a victim, one of the best things that you can do is get them to a hospital that has an on-site social worker. What I didn't realize is that every other field is heavily trained in human trafficking except for like fire and EMS. Like police, we are so far behind the curve. I'm a part of this Central Texas Coalition Against Human Trafficking that works with like the Attorney General's office and different police departments and different victim groups. And it boggles my mind how far behind the ball we are. And sometimes I'll tell them, like, this isn't even talked about in EMS. And they're just like, what? Isn't this something that's known by everyone? And I'm like, no, it's not even taught in school. And so that's kind of my goal with it.
Have you been able to get it incorporated into certain schools?
I have not been able to get it into schools yet. It'd be great if I could. Our medical director, Dr. Remick, and I sat down and we put together like a procedure for what we're going to do with at our service with victims of human trafficking. And so we were able to coordinate that. We talked to our local hospitals, or at the time we had talked to our local hospitals to find out what their capabilities were. If nobody knows what hospital to go to or what hospital has an on-site social worker all the time, all level 1 trauma centers have a social worker in-house all the time. And social workers are very heavily trained in things like this. And so that's wonderful. I always try to encourage people, and I get it. Sometimes the hospital is not the best place for them, but it's a matter of where can they get the resources that they need. I had a coworker have a victim once, and she had told me, because I'll look for feedback. I'm not necessarily looking for feedback of, oh, hey, your lecture is great. I'm looking for feedback of what can I add to my lecture, like if that would be more helpful for people to know, or is there anything in there that you felt like that didn't seem right? One of the women I used to work with, she was like, like I had this woman and I would have thought she was a psych patient. Everything about it screamed psych, but something just felt off. And she was like, and I had thought about it, and she put together the story and she thought, could this be human trafficking? And she couldn't convince that person to go to the hospital with her. So she talked to the police, and she told the police, like, something doesn't make sense. I question whether or not this could be human trafficking, but I sort of feel like maybe it is. And little did she know the police also had the same thoughts. And so they were able to get her help. I guess she actually was a victim, and they were able to get her back to the city that she was taken from. 1-888-373-7888. That is National Human Trafficking Hotline. But yeah, that tip line, it's 24/7, 365. It's a great resource.
Now you have me wondering what the one in Canada is, but I'll have to look that up as well, and I can always add it in the notes.
My understanding is that there is one in Canada. I just don't know what the number is.
This is the magic of technology. In real time, you can look it up.
So there is a Canadian human trafficking hotline. So it's 1-833-900-1010. There's a whole website called Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. My goals with it, I wish it was taught in school. And so I've been lucky enough to peer review a couple of textbooks. One of them was a paramedic textbook. One of them is a EMT textbook. There's still nothing about human trafficking in any of those. So my goal is that hopefully one day it's going to get taught in school. And for our field, I think that the trend is kind of leaning for that to be something that happens. When I go to conferences, it always boggles my mind. One of the first questions I'll ask is, how many people have ever been to a lecture on human trafficking or had education on human trafficking? It never fails. It's like 80 to 90% of the room doesn't raise their hand. And I don't know if it's that they don't want to raise their hand because they just don't want to participate in interaction, or if it's really just because they've never had any training on it. And when I told the coalition I'm in, they were like, what? And I said, yeah. I said, and it makes it really hard to progress a lecture because I've been giving it now since 2019. I feel bad that essentially you're giving people the same information every year, but it makes it hard to move to anything else when you're just always setting the foundation. And so I would love for training to be out there everywhere.
Fortunately, platforms like podcasts and like YouTube and outside of academia, if it doesn't exist, we can just build it ourselves and put it out there and be ahead of them and let them catch up, right?
Yeah, the internet's so wonderful now. It's great how technology works.
Do you do webinars then? Do you do virtual courses for people?
I did do one webinar, I think last year with Image Trend. So there is a webinar on the Image Trend website. I believe that's a free class, whether or not you're in partnership with Image Trend, that people can take.
Can people contact you though and request a virtual lesson or a webinar?
Anybody is always free to email me. You contacted me on Instagram, I think. So my Instagram is super simple. It's like SusieQ384, I think is my Instagram. And then my email is a little longer. It's strongheart, like STRONGHART, strategies, and it's all one word, at gmail.com. I'm always happy to answer questions or give information or resources or try to help people do whatever they can for their departments. I'm speaking at a medical directors conference next month. I'm kind of excited for that because our state does not require human trafficking training. Our Department of State Health Services, they require it for healthcare providers, but EMS is under people. We kind of got left out of that scenario too. If our state isn't going to require it, maybe I can have the state's medical directors require it of their people, because we get taught things like domestic violence and sexual abuse and child abuse and elder abuse. I don't understand why we're not being taught about human trafficking. It's such a big thing. When I got into this, I didn't mean for people to just associate me with human trafficking.
Well, we need people to go down rabbit holes to become, in our circles, our subject matter experts, so to speak, to help us, because we can't possibly go down every rabbit hole that there is, right?
If that's what people think of when they hear my name or think of my name, like, that's okay.
Yeah, that you're doing something about it, right? Your part.
I wasn't a victim of human trafficking. I don't personally have friends that I met before I started doing this that were trafficked. I got into the field and I wanted to make a difference, and I wanted to help people. And this is just such a huge population of people that we're in contact with, that we have the potential to try and help. And we can't help if we don't know.
There are a lot of things in the world that are very dark and heavy, and maybe people are avoidant of certain topics, or even wanting to have it in their social media feed because they're worried about being inundated with images or stories that are too heavy for them. They don't want that as part of their everyday. So I was thinking, while we're talking here, are there any social media pages that are more educating people in a way that's not as heavy, that people could have in their feed, that things will come across, that they'll start to educate themselves, that they don't have to be worried about being overwhelmed with the really deep darkness of it, unless they wanted to go and search out websites and do the deeper dive like you have? Is there something like on the surface that can make an impact in people's education that's not so heavy?
Bob Williams, he has a Facebook page. He's got his own nonprofit. I think he's in Dallas, or he lives in Texas, but he has a ranch hands rescue. He puts out, like, on his social media page on Facebook, he puts out information occasionally about human trafficking victims and just human trafficking awareness in general. I don't know about a social media page for it, but even like the Polaris Project or the National Human Trafficking Hotline's website, they put out a lot of generic information. It's a dark subject. It was a deep research dive that I went on. So I don't know that the surface level things would really take people to a negative place necessarily.
Right, yeah. So that's what I was hoping to lead them to, those things. Their reluctance might come from thinking that the moment they put a toe in the water, so to speak, that they're going to be inundated with darkness, when there probably is more generic.
I don't want people to think that you're going to get inundated. I spent 12 months doing deep research interviews and reading articles and talking to different, I interviewed the guy that helped start the coalition for DPS in Texas, met with different people from the Attorney General's office and Victim Services and Homeland Security, the Human Trafficking Hotline, the DOJ for whatever state that people live in, the Department of the State for whatever state people live in. Things like the Polaris Project are great resources because they have the generic awareness information and they can show you the statistics for different states or for your area. People think of just these big metropolitan cities. Texas, Florida, and California, 3 of the top states for human trafficking in the United States. And New York is, I think, number 4. And we're densely populated. We're these very large states. When you look at the number of victims per capita of people, like Mississippi, I believe, is number 1 for things like that. So I think that awareness is the biggest thing. Being aware, being able to know what you're looking at, or just being able to see the signs. Like, just because you see the signs doesn't mean that human trafficking is going on. But if you don't know what to look for, labor trafficking happens in nail salons and massage parlors and restaurants, like, unfortunately, a lot of restaurants. And I asked one of the women that I interviewed, her name's Paula Tavro. She's an associate professor at UCLA. She interviewed a lot of victims, and they were mostly labor trafficking victims. And I asked her, I said, Paula, like, when somebody comes from a country that they're not making a lot of money in their country, and even though they're only making maybe whatever it is under the table money here, how do you convince them that even though they're making better money here, it's not a good situation for them when they're making more than they would in their own country? And she said, Sue, like, it's a good question, but 100% of all of the labor trafficking victims that I spoke with from other countries said that the circumstances were so horrendous that it was never worth it. And I said, oh, okay. Because that's what I thought. If you get someone from the Philippines or from Mexico and they're living at the restaurant or living homeless or living with like 30 other people, like, how do you convince them that what's happening to them isn't right?
Because we just assumed that it was worse before.
Yeah.
Just because it's a better than worse doesn't mean it's good.
Once she told me that they all said that none of it was ever worth it. They would have rather just lived in their countries with their families, making bare minimum, than going through anything that they ever went through as victims.
Let's lighten up to finish off and tell me about, this is another thing that David offered, was talk to me about laughing hard and then laughing harder because you're laughing at how hard you're laughing.
I can't believe I told you that. So I do sometimes. When someone says something that's really, I guess I have I have this ridiculous laugh when I think things are funny, and sometimes I get stuck in this loop, and I don't even know how to explain it. I'll laugh really hard and
find it funny.
And I can't stop laughing, and I start laughing at myself for the fact that I can't stop laughing, and it's just this never ending. I can't believe he told you that. Yeah, I do that sometimes. And so a lot of times when that happens, I just have to walk away because I have to get my mind focused on something other than you're still laughing at this like 5 minutes later. I'm glad that's an endearing memory that he has of me.
Well, I guess it's also a gift considering what you do for a living and now what you're tackling, that you have that. And then it's probably a gift for other people to witness it.
Yeah, I hope so. Everything's all about a support system in this field. Like, you have to have, I don't know that there is anything. I used to be really against these like high school EMS programs because I thought, why would you do that to somebody so young? Like, it's terrible. Like, I don't want to do it. But then it just became ingrained in our society, and it's a thing. And so I thought, well, I can either just be mad about it and fight against it, or I can try and be someone that helps these young high schoolers that haven't even gone out on their own in the world try and navigate through things. And I think that you have to try and stay lighthearted, because the older I get, like I'm going to be 40 this year, the older I get, the more I look at people and just think like, you're just a kid. But I also have to realize that kids are growing up and experiencing things that like we didn't really have to experience in school at such a young age. I didn't grow up doing active shooter drills in high school, like, or elementary schools. And I think I guess I'm more okay with those programs now because they're already growing up with so much trauma that we didn't necessarily experience that's been normalized for them. And it's all about a support system. To stay lighthearted is all about a support system.
We all need strong heart strategies and light heart strategies.
Yes. We all need strong heart strategies and light heart strategies. Yes.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. It was super important, I think, for everyone to hear about this. And I hope people do a bit of a dive and just at least become more aware.
I hope so too. If you don't know where to look, just Google human trafficking awareness. There's about 1 million websites. And if you have questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me or reach out to the websites and talk about the information, because it's the medical field. So we get told these like horrendous stories on TV and stuff. And those are things that happen. But that's not the most common. Sex trafficking happens without being in a part of a big ring. Sex trafficking can just happen as a couple. It's just a couple and he's trafficking her, or vice versa. And being able to see it. And again, if you call the human trafficking hotline, if you just suspect it, they will do research on 100% of those tips. And I don't really know many hotlines that do something like that. 100%. You can't get better than that.
No, you can't. Thanks so much.
Thank you.